Anyway, so I'm a group leader here at ICOMS in Ruhr University, Bochum. So I'm also in the Max Planck Institute for Sustainable Materials. So we will talk today about FAIR workflows in computational material science with a specific focus on application of these two phase diagrams. Right. Okay. Very good. Yeah. So I would like to start actually with materials databases. So we saw also yesterday talks about materials databases and how they are. Let's see if we can get rid of this. There should be a height, floating meeting controls. Perfect. Yes. So there was a talk yesterday also about materials databases from Professor Marcus, and we saw things like Alexandria, the materials project, Nomad, and so on. So these databases, which contains millions of DFT calculated structures and energies, have really become the foundation of data-driven materials discovery, right? So there's so much data that you can screen this for, you can do large screening for new materials, right? And more importantly, they provide a lot of data for machine learning models. So energies, forces, stresses, and so on. And that has led to the development of a number of models, which are very useful, like this one, for example. You might have seen this paper from some time ago from the guys at Google. So this was scaling deep learning for materials discovery. So they set up, they trained a neural network model on their data set, and they used it to then predict stable materials. So what they mean by stable materials is those that are lower in energy, yes. And exploration by this model actually led to the discovery of something like 381,000 new stable materials. So yesterday, again, we heard that Professor Marcus said that we have pretty much discovered that everything there is to discover in terms of materials. All possible combinations exist in these databases, but there are still things to do, right? So one of the crucial problems that we still don't know is the lack of understanding of phase transitions. So what happens when you heat these things up? What happens when you add a bit of disorder? What happens with configurational entropy? So are these materials really stable? So if you have 5 different compounds, five different elements in an element, like a high entropy one, how does it get stabilized? So all of these are still things that we don't have answers for. And how do we do that? It turns out we knew the answer from a long time ago, phase diagrams. So we've been calculating phase diagrams since a long time experimentally. So what does a phase diagram say? So you have an example here of the copper gold system. And if you look at it, you can see that we get the whole temperature and composition interval, and it tells which phase is stable at what given conditions, right? So you can see when is my copper gold one stable or the copper rich phase. And it also gives you information about how the melting temperature changes and also how it solidifies, right? So if you take a liquid and cool it down, what phases does it go through? It becomes disordered solid first, then it orders, and so on. So these are all information that we can get. And what we would like to deal with a little bit today is how we can calculate these phase diagrams from really atomistic simulations. Right. So that's my outline today. So I will start with a bit of details on how we can get these sort of free energies from first principle calculations or ab initio calculations. Then we'll take a look at how we can build these phase diagrams with these workflows. And finally, about tools for reproducibility, so FAIR workflows and things like that, and software aspects. Good. So let's get started with the first part. Yeah, so like we just saw, we have a phase diagram on the top here, top right, which is very stable, which is very easy. It just has 2 phases, the liquid and solid phase, right? And if I take a temperature T0, which is marked there, and then you decide to plot the free energies at this given temperature, it looks something like this. So you can see to the left of this line, you have the solid phase, which is the most stable one here, and to the right, there's the liquid. So in between is what we call as the common tangent construction, right? So these 2 phases coexist there, and that's the main key. So what do we really need to calculate? So to get phase diagrams, you just need to get free energies. So for a single phase, this would be just free energy as a function of the pressure and temperature. And if you have, for example, binary system as function of composition and temperature. So when we do that, so you can get free energies from ab initio calculations in a couple of different methods. So there's of course things like TU tilde and TOR tilde approaches where they calculate the free energy by splitting it up really into the individual components and summing them up, starting with internal energy, electronic contribution, the quasi-harmonic and anharmonic contributions, and so on. There is also combination of ab initio and statistical mechanics. So what you can do is calculate the mixing enthalpy from methods like cluster expansion, and add vibrational contributions on top and so on. There are also mean field models, which are kind of sampling free estimation of free energies. But the path we will take today, especially because we are also discussing about AI and ML, things are using high accuracy machine learning interatomic potentials. So that's what we will use to run actual MD molecular dynamics simulations and then calculate the free energies. Right. So how does it look like in general? So as I mentioned in the beginning of my talk, we have all of these databases like Alexandria, Materials Project, Nomad, and so on. And often you also supplement it with your own calculations depending on what kind of system that you're interested in. So in this case, we use WASP, which is an ab initio DFT tool. And then you parameterize the machine learning interatomic potentials on top of it. So in this case, I will also focus on the atomic cluster expansion. And then you actually run these calculations with tools like LAMMPS to get the free energies. Right. So this is the procedure we follow. And if we take a look at how to calculate free energies, now we are diving a bit more deep into the methods. How we calculate free energies. So you might, almost everybody might have heard about thermodynamic integration. So it's a very classic method in statistical physics or statistical mechanics even. And what we do there is that you have a reference system and then you have a system of interest. The reference system is something comparatively simple, right? So you can write down the free energy of the system, maybe analytically or with some code or something like this. And then you have a system of interest, is what we are interested in. And these two are linked with a parameter. In this case, it's a coupling parameter lambda. And you can do simulations and you apply these equations and you end up with the free energy of the system. Right. But if we take a look again at this copper gold phase diagram that we saw, right? So if it has 5 phases and we want to do these calculations now with phase, temperature, and these lambda values, we are looking at something like 150,000 calculations. That's quite a bit, right? So that's the first part. So we want to somehow try and make it manageable. And therefore, we need some improvements to thermodynamic integration, right? So what we do there are 2 things mostly. So one is a non-equilibrium thermodynamic integration. So instead of having these lambda values where these systems are coupled to each other, now we say, oh, let's take a lambda value which is time dependent. And as a function of time, we switch it back and forth, right? So that reduces one dimension and you're left with something like 1,500 calculations. Then you can do things like reversible scaling. So what happens there is once you have a free energy, you take that system and you scale its Hamiltonian. So it turns out that if you do something like that, it is equivalent to increasing the temperature, and you can again get the whole free energy variation with temperature from a single simulation. So that reduces it further to something like 50 calculations. Anyway, the main message here is that these sort of methodological improvements allow us to drastically reduce the number of calculations, so we can do free energy calculations quite efficiently. But as you saw now, there are a large number of steps and possibly a combination of tools that you need to make these things work. So that's a bit of the catch. So which brings me to my second part now, which is building phase diagrams with workflows. So what we will try to do there is now to put together all of these methodology that we quickly took a look at and see how we can create phase diagrams with it. Right. So we just discussed how the methodology behind calculation of free energies. So if we really write it down in terms of a workflow, how does that look like? So there are a couple of more things, right? So you start with some input conditions like the temperature, pressure, you need a structure, of course, an interatomic potential. And then you can start by, for example, relaxing the system at constant pressure, from which you calculate the lattice constant. And you move on to something like a constant volume calculation. And then you do the switching step that we discussed between the 2 systems, and finally match with the free energy. So these sort of workflows we have implemented in a tool called Calfee, so you can directly use it in an automated way and run these calculations, right? So if we compress all of these steps that I discussed now into one single box, it's not enough, right? So there are more things that needs to be done to get the whole workflow in. So that includes things like, getting the data from the repositories, clubbing it with additional data, and then you need to parameterize these machine learning potentials, and of course you need some sort of validation. So normally it is done with things like LAMMPS or tools like Pyiron and so on, and then you can calculate the phase diagram and do some post-processing steps. So we have implemented these as workflows, and people have used it, including me, of course. And what you see here are some unary phase diagrams. So on the left, we have magnesium with atomic cluster expansion. The DFT data is also in the background, and you see that it looks quite nice and with decent agreement. We have some classical interatomic potentials here, silicon with a Stillinger-Weber potential and compared with a couple of others, and titanium with the pressure temperature phase diagram with just an EAM potential. So what I would like to show is that you can apply these things to actually calculate the phase diagrams, right? And it can also be done for binaries. So I also have a couple of examples here. So that's copper zirconium. So you can see it's a fairly complex system. It's a large number of phases, and these guys really parameterized an atomic cluster expansion potential and did calculations at very, let's say, very small composition and temperature intervals, and got the phase diagram, which looks very nice, of course. We have aluminium lithium, again a binary system. And yes, okay, I have some more. Silicon oxygen, which is once again a bit of a complicated system. It's not really a binary phase diagrams. It's just silicon oxygen with two components. It's in a way one phase, but you see how they transform under pressure, right? So on the left, I think you have the DFT one, and on the right, the one from the interatomic potentials, and they also find reasonable agreement. Once again, this is an atomic cluster expansion potential. And one of the recent works is one for aluminium and magnesium, again with now a different flavor of machine learning potentials, the moment tensor potentials. And here you can even see the comparisons to DFT data with the dotted, with the comparison to the CalFAT method with the dotted black lines, and you see how the agreement is quite nice. So all of these phase diagrams have been calculated employing this method, so we can really now efficiently do this sort of calculations, right? Sorry. Good. So just as I mentioned, they all look nice, but all of these calculations, when you put it in a paper, we don't see how many things go behind it. So there are a large number of simulations that go behind it, and they are all combined and post-processed to get these nice pictures. So we are talking about thousands of calculations still for one phase diagram, right? So how do we ensure reproducibility? So that's really the crux of the thing I want to discuss today too. So how we can ensure that all of these things we do are actually reproducible, right? So for that, we come to the third part, which is, of course, tools for reproducibility and FAIR workflows. Yeah, so it turns out that published does not always mean reproducible. So I have an example here, which I show all the time, but it's a quite famous one. So this is one of the initial, early machine learning models from 2016. So what they did was to use an ML model to predict the band gap of inorganic materials, and it's cited quite a bit of times, right? So these are also quite famous people, so you might know everyone there. Exactly. So it turns out that the same guys, Log and Ward, for example, published another preprint where they tried to reproduce their own work, and turned out they couldn't do it. And what happened was something like this. So you see that's the band gap, and the red points are what they initially predicted in the paper. And when they reproduced it, and depending on what random seed that they used, they got the whole range of answers, right? So in the blue that you see. So it turns out that it was not fully reproducible, and you're looking at changes of like 2 electron volts in bandwidth, which changes completely what a material is. So, and they tried to sit down and see why this happened, and the major conclusions was one, that reporting of computational dependencies. So they used a number of tools that go into this, and then nobody really wrote down what version of what software was used, and things changed in the future, and you couldn't just do it. Yeah, versioning. And more importantly, sequential code organization. So what I mean by that is that we saw now Jupyter notebooks have become the tool that we all use for data science and machine learning and to do things in an interactive way. And they suffer from a bit of a problem, right? So you can execute one cell, execute something else, come back to it again and do it. So you don't really have a code organization. So it really depends on what order you go in. And it turns out that also it was not clear what steps to run first, right? So that's also a bit of the problem. And clarifying code references within the manuscript. So if you publish a paper and you say, oh, I used tool A to do this and get this picture, but you don't say exactly what function or what version and what particular where you got it from, then it's also very hard, right? So what's the solution for all of this? It turns out it's scientific workflows, and we can apply then scientific workflows to solve some of our issues. and that's FAIR computational workflow. So what does FAIR mean for computational workflows? I normally have a slide about FAIR, which I of course skipped here because you're called FAIRmat, so that makes no sense. And if you look at computational workflows, this is like a hybrid product, right? It has software, it has data, and on top of it, because of its complex nature, it has some unique requirements. So a workflow is just a complex multi-step method, right? It can be used for data collection, preparation, analytics, any of these things. And yeah, like I mentioned, they are closely related to software, but of course also has additional constraints. And the R in here can be also interpreted in a couple of different ways. So you reuse, rerun, replicate, repurpose, recycle, and of course for me, reproduce, right? That's also an important thing. Good. So when we try to sketch it a little bit, this is how a simple workflow could look like. So you have some software one and another software, then you want to do something that combines the two of them together, right? And you have some inputs that go in, which is processed by software one, and you get some outputs out, and then you feed it into the software two, and then you get a final output. Right, so if you look at this condition, the one thing that we have to be careful about and keep in mind is that each of these softwares here have to somehow obey the FAIR principles for research software, right? So that includes things like metadata and identifiers, software dependencies, standard formats for inputs and outputs, and authorship, scientific references, and so on. Yeah, so we can take a closer look. So the FAIR principles for research software look something like this. So I've just tried to point out only the most important aspects, right? So it's very similar to FAIR principles for data, but slightly different in the sense findable means that you have sort of a global and unique identifier for all of the software packages that you use. And you have rich metadata, community standards, and control vocabulary, and your metadata, of course, also includes identifiers, right? And interoperable means here that you have an API that you can communicate with, very similar to, for example, the Nomad API we saw. And you have references to other softwares, and you can exchange data between them. Also, it should be accessible through some common channel. So PIP is a common popular one, can be Conda. Yeah, if you have some script that you're passing around, nah, that's not good, yeah. And reusable, of course, that the software can be executed and incorporated into other software. So you have a license, you have community standards that people can read and understand your code, and of course, resolvable dependencies, right? And then when we look at the blue box outside it, the picture, right? So that's the environment that combines both of your software together. So that's kind of the workflow. And then it should take care of, for example, the execution environments, the execution order or the provenance, and the data exchange between the different steps, right? So when we put it all together, that's then the FAIR principles for workflows. And a number of tools in the community. So when you look at it like common workflow language, Nextflow, SnakeMakes, they all follow the same approach. So it's nothing new now or something, something groundbreaking, but it has been kind of the standard that has been followed in the community. So all of these workflow environments, what they have in common is that they have individual steps where you can specify your inputs and outputs and what tools to run, right? But we wanted to have something a bit more. So we wanted to support the Python ecosystem fully. So if you look at things like common workflow language, that's always serialized and saved into the disk, and then you read it in the next step. But we wanted something that's a bit more fluid, and that was to exchange complex Python objects between the individual steps of a workflow, and do things like cyclic workflows, which is very common in computational material science. Think of a DFT convergence loop or something like this. Right. So with that so with that in mind is what we use the new version of Pyiron, which is called Pyiron Workflow. And I would like to show a small example. So it's a little bit of code, but you don't have to go into details. But this is the example of one of the steps that I discussed in the first parts, the calculation of free energy once again. And I have three functions here, right? So the first function does something like create a structure. And the second one is choosing a potential. And finally, the third one is calculating the free energy, right? So they are simple Python functions, so you can get started. Anyone can get started. If you can write some Python code, you can use these things. And the only thing that is different is this little decorator, a Python decorator on top, right? So that's what takes your function and converts it to what we call as a workflow node. So then it includes things like dependencies, and you can execute them in different environments and so on. So still they are sort of individual steps, right? So exactly. So you can see that it's more or less a self-contained Python function. Exactly. So they are still individual steps. So how do we combine them together? So that is with this workflow object. So you have these individual functions that we saw before, and you can put them together into a workflow. So this workflow is just called Calfee. And you see that the first step, which is structure, so I call it structure, and we equate it to the function that we just created. So you can call it anything, of course. And then the next one is just called a potential, and then we combined it with our list potentials function. But now you see that it takes one input, which was the previous step of the workflow. So that's how you link them together. So you know that the input for the second steps comes from the previous one. And in the third one is just free energy, which takes both of the previous steps and takes them in together to do a calculation. Yeah, so explicitly specifies inputs and outputs of each step, which is crucial. Also things like delayed execution. So you can fully compose your workflow and examine it, nothing is run, and then you run it later, or you submit it to a high performance computing cluster or something like this. Caching, so when you rerun your workflows, only things that failed or didn't run are executed, or if you change the inputs, otherwise they don't run. And of course, you can also share workflows by creating nodes of nodes, right? So if I give a script like this with the associated nodes, it's something that people can, for example, change the inputs and rerun and get for something else. Good. And we also wanted to make it easy for people who are not super, let's say, experts on programming. So it also has a nice, cute graphical user interface. And this is the same functions that we saw before in a graphical user interface, and you can connect them, connect these different nodes together and run them. But the nice thing is that it is sort of a one-to-one relationship with the code and the interface, right? So you can write the code, directly open it in the interface, add more things, you check your workflow looks good, and you can export it back to code, right? So there are people who really don't want to either look at the graphical interface, or some of them the other way around, only want to look at it, so it satisfies everybody. And if you want to quickly take a visual look and see your loops looks fine or something else, that's also something you can do. Yeah, so you can switch between the code and visual interface and also reduce the programming effort a lot, right? So we put all of these things together now, including the first steps, and we really put together a workflow for the complete life cycle of a machine learning potential in a way, starting from the parameterization. So what we did here was to use data from materials project and also our own structure and get the energies in WASP, and fit a potential. So we use 3 flavors, a classical EAM potential, 2 kinds of machine learning ones, one with a high dimensional neural network and atomic cluster expansion. And we do a validation of properties and also has an active learning loop. So from the validation, you can also plug in more structures to the data generation, and finally calculate the phase diagrams, right? So if you want to try a mini version of it, so you can go to the link there. So it's go-fairworkflows.org, FAIRmat talk, and you have the whole workflows and things. It opens on your browser, so you can just interactively run it now if you like to. Very good. So I think with that, I'm already at the summary of my talk. So in the first part, we took a look at the different methodologies, right? So we saw how non-equilibrium free energy methods and the combination, especially with machine learning interatomic potentials, can allow for computationally efficient calculation of free energies and therefore phase diagrams. And we also saw that workflows that can chain multiple softwares can be used for rather automated phase diagrams. And finally, FAIR workflows are needed to ensure that the computational research is reproducible. So once again, this was done within parts of it within MATwork. And if you want to try the workflows, please go to the link and try it out. Thank you very much for your attention.